everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going to be sharing some of my favorite isolation trope thrillers. This is one of my favorite tropes, and I delight when it turns up in a book, and it doesn't turn up as frequently as it should, in my humble opinion, though that said, I guess if everyone started writing them, it would saturate the market, and that wouldn't be great either. But I wanted to share 13 isolation trope thrillers that I rather enjoyed. They come in a couple different flavors, but if you also like isolation trope thrillers, or if you haven't read one, you really should because they're great. I'm gonna share some of those examples for you. But what is the isolation trope? Essentially, it's when a character or bunch of characters, not too many characters, but enough, are in an isolated location and then murders start happening or creepy things start happening. And a massive part of the stakes are derived from the fact that you as the reader and eventually the characters realize we are trapped in a place with no access to help or very little access to help. And someone here is a murderer. The stakes are basically baked into the concept, very high stakes. It leads to a reading experience where you suspect everyone, the main character suspects everyone, the tension is really, really high, you're looking for clues everywhere, and it is coupled with the fact that you and the characters are like, we might die before help can reach us, so. I'm actually gonna start by recommending the granddaddy of isolation trope thrillers, the one that has inspired so many of the other ones on this list. Quite clearly when you read them, you can see the inspiration. And it is a classic of mystery thrillers for a reason, and that is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I don't know if this created the trope, but it definitely popularized it. It's the one that I always think of and that I think everyone else thinks of. It was originally called, well, it was originally called something very racist, and then it was changed to something less racist at the time, but still racist now, which is why now we call it And Then There Were None, but it was originally called 10 Little Indians. So you might be familiar with it under that title or certainly that trope because that was used in a ton of different media. It was adapted a bunch of times, but it's essentially a bunch of people receive a mysterious invitation to a party on an island, to a manor house on an island, and there's a huge storm, and then they start dying one by one. And whomever the killer is, they have these figurines on a table. There are 10 of them, and every time someone dies, one of them disappears from the table, and it's a countdown one by one as to who is the killer and will they figure it out before they all die. So next, and before I dive into the full list, I had mixed feelings about some of the books on the list. Some of these are like home run 5-star reads for me. Some of them I had various issues with, and I will kind of throw that in there just so you know. I'm not going to do full reviews of all of these, but because I love the isolation trope so much, I still enjoyed every single one of these books enough that I thought it was worth including on the book list. So just want to mention that because the next one is An Unwanted Guest by Shari Lapena. I had some issues with this book, just stylistic issues with some of the choices that were made in third person, but as an isolation trope, it is A+. Excellent. This one is a group of disparate individuals who are staying at a B&B type place, I believe in upstate New York, and there's a big ice storm, cuts off all the power, cuts off the roads, and then someone dies. And then they all suspect each other, and then someone else dies. You catch my drift. In terms of the trope and the tension and how it's executed, I really, really found it satisfying. The things that I didn't 100% love about it, I did cover in depth in a review, which I will link to down below, but they didn't override the fact that I love the isolation trope so much that I do recommend this to fans of the isolation trope. Next is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This one is a group of people who are attending a wedding on an isolated island off the coast of, I believe, Scotland. You see a trend? Isolated, cut off, and natural disasters. There's a storm. You see a trend? which if I recall correctly, I think in this one means they can't contact the mainland, rescue can't come for a while. Basically, someone at the wedding dies. This one has multi-POV and jumps back and forth in time. You kind of know that someone at the wedding dies. There's a body stumbled upon in the dark, and then it goes back in time, multi-POV, to before the wedding. So it's building up and you're trying to piece together kind of who are these people, how are they related, which one of them is the victim, and obviously someone at this wedding is the killer. It's less of a, you know, ratchet tension of like, there are only 8 people here and we have no hope of rescue, we're gonna die, because it is actually a whole ass wedding. There's several hundred people on the island with them. The tension comes more from which one of these people is going to die and who is the killer. But it still has the classicness of the trope because it's got the island cut off with storm kind of aspect of it. So I enjoyed it for that reason. Next is In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. I love this book, and the thing about it is I actually found aspects of the twist very kind of easy to guess and clearly telegraphed, and I literally did not care because of how well it pulled off the isolation trope for me personally as a reader. This one's a bachelorette party. It's also got a bit of the dual timeline going on. You know that in the future that the main character is in the hospital and she's had a bad hit to the head and she doesn't remember what happened. She just knows someone's dead and the police are there and they want to question her, and you kind of go back and forth between her in the hospital and the past of what happened. And what makes this isolation trope is they are at a cabin in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the woods, out in the country in the UK. And what really did it for me, Dark Woods, I mean the title, In a Dark, Dark Wood, it's a glass house. And that's like a trope on top of a trope, but I'm like, so they're isolated in the woods, but they're actually not completely isolated, which is a different kind of aspect to the isolation trope thriller, because you can't have ones where it's not necessarily that it's someone in the house, but that you're isolated but not completely cut off, and so you don't necessarily know who is around you. And this is one of those because there were so many beautiful, delicious moments of tension where the character is in this glass house in the middle of the night staring out into the woods, and is there someone outside? And I love that too. But it still has that aspect of they are far enough from everything and everyone, and it has that classic, instead of bad weather cutting them off, simply, oh, we're in the middle of nowhere and cell phones never work here. So, and I guess I think the landline does get cut. It's that kind of thing where like, oh, my text message didn't send because of the bad service here, and you use that to build tension. But it does have that menace of if there is someone out there, if we're not as isolated as we think, help won't be able to get to us. I'm just gonna tell you the next 2 are Ruth Ware thrillers because Ruth Ware loves this trope as much as I do, clearly, which might be why I like Ruth Ware thrillers so much, because she comes to the well of this trope over and over again. She's just done it in a couple of different ways. And so the next one, and actually I'm thinking about it, I said that this list would have 13 on it, but I'm actually gonna throw an extra Ruth Ware book in here because I'm like, that is definitely an isolation trope thriller. She just does it over and over again. So we're just gonna run through these one by one by Ruth Ware. This one is the most classic. She was very clearly inspired by And Then There Were None, hence the title. This one is a ski chalet in the French Alps. There is an avalanche. People start dying. They're in a ski chalet that like has been half destroyed by the snow. One of them is definitely the killer, and it counts down from there. Has really delicious tension. I mean, as an isolation trope thriller, it's a home run. I actually ended up having kind of a journey with this one. I read it as an arc and I gave it like 5 stars because like it scratched the itch, the isolation trope itch that I have so thoroughly, because it had a lot of spiritual similarities to the And Then There Were None kind of setup. When I reread it later, I had some like minor issues with aspects of the thriller outside of the isolation trope, but it accomplishes the isolation trope so well that I wholeheartedly recommend it if that's a thing that you like. So then next is The Woman in Cabin 10, which I can't believe I didn't have this on the list originally. They're literally on a boat. Isolation trope is situations where you are in a contained location where there's high stakes because of weather or the inability to get help or both, and this is on a boat. in the middle of nowhere. Someone dies and they're on a boat, and if I recall correctly, there's definitely some conceit in it where they're unable to contact people for reasons. These books always come up with very clever reasons as to why you're cut off from communication and help. I think the reason I didn't think of it immediately is because the strongest trope of this book is not isolation trope, it's doing a rear window thing, where it's got the unreliable narrator, she's an alcoholic, and she thinks that she saw someone murdered in the cabin next to hers, but everyone is like, no one is staying in this cabin, are you okay? But they are isolated on a boat. So I'm gonna throw this one in there. And then next is another Ruth Ware isolation thriller, which is The Turn of the Key. Spiritually, this one is very similar to In a Dark, Dark Wood, or most similar to In a Dark, Dark Wood in how it executes the isolation trope, though they are completely different because In a Dark, Dark Wood is just a straight up commercial thriller. The Turn of the Key is a gothic thriller. This one is a modernized version of The Turn of the Screw, but it has a smart house in the isolated countryside in Scotland, and it does kind of that glass house thing again. It's a modified Victorian little cottage where they've built an addition on it, and that addition is lots of big glass windows, and so it does the creepy I'm in the house late at night and the lights are on inside but it's pitch black outside and wait, is someone watching me? It does that thing as well. But it's this nanny who's isolated in this house in the middle of nowhere, and if I recall correctly, she either couldn't drive or didn't have access to a car. Like, isolation trope thrillers find many ways to cut the characters off from rescue, escape, help, and she's with these two kids and these things start happening. This one is less an isolation trope thriller in the sense that it's not like someone dies and it's like I'm in the house with a killer, but it's things start happening that are very scary, that because it's the turn of the screw that caused the nanny to question her own sanity, to question whether there's something supernatural going on because it's a gothic, and it kind of snowballs from there. But you kind of get the isolation trope thriller-ness out of it because of the location, the lack of help, and kind of how that raises the stakes as the book reaches its climax. What can I say? I just really love creepy woods books, and there's another one on this list because creepy woods books tend to kind of intersect with the isolation trope thriller because the woods are creepy because you're in the middle of nowhere, and that. So next is not a Ruth Ware book. It is The Girls' Weekend by Jody Gehrman. This one is about a group of women who were friends in college and they kind of drifted apart for various reasons, including some very complicated social dynamics in their friend group, specifically the main character. I mean, the group had a queen bee who was like the rich, beautiful one who ended up getting everything the main character June ever wanted. She literally marries June's ex. They both were aspiring writers, and June has not succeeded in being a published writer, and Sadie is an international bestseller with a movie franchise. So there's tension in the relationship of these old college friends, but they are doing a reunited weekend at Sadie's isolated mansion in Seattle, outside of Seattle in Washington State, because one of them is having a baby, and they all come together and it's tense, and then something happens. Sadie disappears and it might be foul play, and it's kind of like, is Sadie messing with us? Was Sadie kidnapped or is Sadie dead? But if so, it's definitely someone in the house on the property. There is a hot, like groundsman character, as well as Sadie's husband, Ethan, and there's lots of complications there. But you get that isolation trope from, this is kind of a mansion property, an estate type property. It's not completely cut off. The book doesn't play with the whole, oh, we can't call the cops, help can't come. They actually don't want to call the cops or involve anyone because it's unclear what happened to Sadie. But if something did, they're all basically suspects. It's the other friends, I think it's 3 of them or 4 of them, but they got blackout drunk and then they woke up and found blood, and so they also don't know if they did something to Sadie. So it's kind of a twist on the isolation trope. It's not about there not being help, but it's the, we were all here, it's someone here who did something, who was it? we can't remember, and trying to piece that together. The main reason I really ended up liking this book was all the social dynamics. I found it really delicious and tense, but for me, the semi-isolation trope of it, kind of the big isolated estate, just added to how much I liked the book. Next is The Perfect Guest by Emma Rous. This one's not out yet, but it's coming out, I believe, this spring. It's kind of a partial isolation trope, like it plays on that. It's, again, a manor house that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. There is a village nearby, but it's a multi-timeline book where you get a massive chunk of the book that takes place in the 80s from the perspective of a teenage girl, and she is a foster kid who's staying with this wealthy family. It's got a real gothic feel. If I were making a gothic Rex list, this would be on that as well. One of the Ruth Ware ones too. Gosh, The Death of Mrs. Westaway is also kind of an isolation thriller. I'm not gonna get into it, but you can just add that to your list. Ruth Ware really just does the same trope, but it's a trope that works and I don't want her to stop. So anyway, back to The Perfect Guest. It's got that gothic thing going on where she's staying with this family on this estate. She knows something is going on because it is in the countryside. There's a small village nearby. It feels very isolated because it feels like there's not really much outside of the estate. It definitely does the thing. There are no cell phones in the 1980s portion, but in the future portion, is that there's a different character who is an actress working a murder mystery party at the same isolated manor house, and you know that someone died in the 80s, and part of the tension comes from figuring that out, not so much the isolation trope. But in the present, in her narrative where she's at this murder mystery party and stuff starts happening, there is the aspect of, oh, our cell phones don't work, and realizing that clearly someone at this murder mystery party is guilty of something, is some kind of bad guy. You don't know who died in the past. It's all kind of building up, but you do know that this manor house is in the middle of nowhere. Clearly something really bad went down, that someone is angry about something and pulling some sort of fast one at this party. A girl disappears, the cell phones don't work, there's a fire. And so you get like some of those isolation trope thrills off of the fact that the house is cut off and the cell phones don't work and that sort of thing. Next is one of my beloved Creepy Woods books, and that is The Girl from Widow Hills by Megan Miranda. So this one, again, it's not total isolation. The character is able to go into town. It's a cabin in the woods. She does have a close neighbor, and that's part of the tension actually. It's kind of the, is the neighbor home? Can she reach him? Can he help her type thing? But it has the vibe of this woman who has a past. She is the girl from Widow Hills, and you start piecing together over the course of the narrative what that means and why she has changed her name and why she is running. But she's happy to live basically off the grid in the middle of nowhere with creepy woods. But she finds a body in the middle of the night in the creepy woods, and it has that aspect of who was this person who died on her property. There are cops who get involved, of course. It drags up her past, but throughout the book she feels like someone is watching her. She suspects someone is coming into her house when she's not there. So it has that vibe repeatedly, the kind of middle of the night, I'm in my home, but am I safe? Is someone watching me? Is someone upstairs kind of thing, where her cabin is definitely far enough away from the little town in North Carolina where this takes place that even if she could call for help, the cops wouldn't get there in time. I mentioned there's the question of the neighbor. Well, there's actually the question of, is the neighbor shady? Is the neighbor shady, or will he help her if something is going on? So like a couple of the other ones, it's not a pure isolation trope thriller, but for me, because of the creepy woods thing and the isolation of the home that she chose for herself, and it basically, the reason she chose it being far away from people, kind of turning on her thing, it's all about kind of the adrenaline that you get out of the trope that you love, and I got out of this book what I often get out of isolation tropes, which is why I put it on here. Next is The Safe Place by Emma Downs. You're gonna see a trend. This works with a lot of isolation trope thrillers. It is a manor estate in middle of nowhere France, but like rich France. It's a very nice estate. And this young woman who is a failed actress, she is hired to be like a nanny slash personal assistant, more of a personal assistant to a very wealthy woman. Her husband, who is in the UK and only comes to France every couple of months, long story, like literally it's part of the book, hires this woman to basically help his wife because she's decorating this place that they bought and she's struggling to get all of the DIY projects done while watching their 6 or 7-year-old daughter. And where it gets isolation trope is it's described how like it takes forever to drive there, and to get there you go on this weird side wood path, and like the gate is electronically locked, and there's lots of tension that comes from that, like kind of being, are you locked into a place in the middle of nowhere? And the wife is kind of weird and the kid is kind of weird, and there's just one person who works for the family and the young woman doesn't know if she can trust him. And it's the kind of estate, because you know, rich people, there are 2 houses and mom and daughter live in one and this nanny who's been hired lives in another, and it's got that whole thing of like, is there someone else in the house with me? So it kind of does that aspect of the isolation trope. Definitely the case where she's far enough from anyone being able to help her, but it has the social isolation essentially. If she's in a foreign country, she doesn't have any friends or allies here. She's cut off from her family because there are reasons that she's not getting along well with her parents. So she doesn't have friends apparently. So she's very isolated in that she has no one to turn to. So when things are starting to happen where she doesn't know who she can trust. Next is Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl. This one's interesting. It's kind of like a sideways inclusion here as well, like some of the other ones. It's definitely technically an isolation trope book, but this is a speculative suspense YA crossover. And essentially, I mean, it's in the copy, so this isn't really spoilers, but it is speculative in that it does the Groundhog Day trope. It is a group of rich kids staying in a swanky mansion that's kind of isolated, and then they get into a car accident and they get stuck in a loop. They're essentially existing in the liminal space between life and death, and they're going to keep repeating the same day over and over and over again until they figure something out that enables them to live or move on. And it's an isolation trope in the sense that they literally can only socialize with the 5 of them. They're stuck in a time loop. They're kind of outside of things. And you get the suffocation feel that you're gonna get out of an isolation trope from this book. And there's definitely aspects of not trusting the other people. A lot of questions come up about like, well, are the things that we have to resolve the secrets that you're hiding? Is this about the murder that happened last year? That kind of thing. So this also would easily slot into the trope of kind of secrets from the past. It's also got some boarding school stuff going for it, but it scratches some of the itch that you might get if you love isolation tropes. So that's why I wanted to include it here. Speaking of boarding schools, the next one is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. Again, this falls on the speculative side. It is a contemporary suspense, but it has a very sci-fi-ish feel. There is a virus. These girls at their school are in quarantine. It's a sci-fi-y virus, so it has literally mutated parts of their body. All of any living creature on the island, but like animals and stuff, are like horribly mutated and very murderous. But the government has abandoned this school on this island off the coast of Maine, and it's a fight for survival kind of book. So it's not a traditional thriller, but it definitely has that feel where a lot of the stakes come from the fact that they are literally cut off from the rest of society. There are supply drops that come every few weeks, and the inciting incident is actually one of the main characters being chosen to be on boat duty to go and get these shipments, and there are kind of conspiracy elements and kind of finding out what's really going on kind of thing in it. So it's definitely more on the sci-fi horror end, but I definitely liked the whole, ooh, boarding school on an island and a freaky virus and something going on aspect. So it still kind of scratched that itch again, so to speak. Last but certainly not least is The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. This is an adult thriller, and if you are in the international world, if you are a Swedish reader, this already came out in Swedish, but it's coming out in English translation this spring, at least in the US. And this one is, I mean, it's an isolation trope thriller, a pretty pure one all the way, but it's also got like a cult vibe. I did end up having some reservations on this one that I'm going to go in depth on when I film my wrap up for the winter, which I haven't done yet, and I will include a few of those caveats, but from an isolation trope thriller perspective, it nails it. It is a documentary crew who go to this famous lost village in Sweden. One day in 1959, over 900 residents of this village, very far out from the rest of society, just disappeared. And it's become kind of an urban legend, a conspiracy theory thing where no one knows what happened. They never found any bodies. And everyone wonders, did they go off into the woods? Were they killed? But where are the bodies? They've never dredged the lake, like that kind of stuff. And the documentary filmmaker is the great-granddaughter of a woman who was from this town. And the only reason she escaped whatever happened to the villagers is she had already moved to Stockholm for school. But essentially her grandmother's entire family disappeared, and so it's a part of her own kind of family DNA, this mystery of what happened in the village. And so it's a passion project for her to make this documentary, and she brings a small crew. It's a scouting mission. They're gonna take photos, do some preliminary footage so that they can put together like a Kickstarter campaign to fully fund their documentary. And they show up and there's all the creepy atmosphere, and there are moments where like, did they just hear some laughter? Were those footsteps? It has kind of, it's not a gothic, but it has aspects of gothic where you definitely, I mean, because there's a supernatural question of like, did something supernatural happen? Definitely some Blair Witch vibes. And then something bad happens. I mean, it's a pure isolation trope in the sense that, yeah, people start dying. And the question is it one of us? Because multiple people on this small crew end up having connections to the village, which is very, very interesting. Ulterior motives for sure. Or are they not alone? And if they're not alone, what are they gonna do? Like, in terms of specific stakes, first of all, not only do cell phones not work here, but they're very clear that on foot, it is 26 miles to the next town. And this is brought up because originally when they discovered that there was no one in the village, the people who originally discovered it had to run 26 miles. So they ran overnight to the next village to be like, something happened. Because, oh, I should have mentioned, when everyone disappeared from the village, all they found was a dead body and a live baby. So there's all this intrigue going on. And of course, you know that the book is gonna find a way for their vehicles not to work, and it does that whole kind of thing, and it's this just creepy abandoned village. So it had some really good isolation trope vibes, but I just do want to mention briefly, I do think this book comes with a couple of trigger warnings. It is very culty. There's definitely a culty aspect. So I've seen it comped to Midsommar, and I think that's why, but it's not really like Midsommar. It's definitely more like Blair Witch vibes. But if that's not your jam, it's not gonna work for you. But also, and I am gonna go into it in depth in my video review, I would give this a trigger warning for some depictions of mental health as well as disability. So if that kind of raises the hair on the back of your neck, this would definitely be an isolation trope thriller that I would skip. So sadly, that's it. Those are the ones that I could kind of find from my Goodreads list that I felt kind of fit into this trope. I know there must be more out there. I love reading them. So first point of order is I want you to drop down below in the comments if you know a really good juicy isolation trope thriller. Hit me up with that, because honestly, I'm gonna keep reading. It's one of my favorite tropes, and I can always do a part 2 for this video. If you like these sort of themed book list type videos, give this video a thumbs up and I will make more of them. I have a couple of ideas, like doing one that's like YA crossover thrillers, for example. I could do Small Town Secret, Secret Sociopath, although the trouble with a trope list like that is that it gets a spoiler, but I digress. If If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching and happy reading.